Hola estudiantes, ¿cómo están? Hoy es el 3 de junio. Vamos a ver qué tenemos para hoy. So, you're finishing up lección 3 sobre la vida diaria, and you're coming up on the chapter exam. So, in this chapter, we looked at vocabulary having to do with daily chores, la casa, los quehaceres, etc. And then the main grammar points had to do with the past tense, the preterite versus the imperfect. So it's always a good idea to take atando cabos seriously. Atando cabos is simply the prueba de práctica, and this gives you an idea of what area you need to work a little bit harder in, what you need to review a little bit more before you take the actual exam. So this tries to replicate the conditions of the exam. So of course here we have several activities that have to do with the vocabulary, and then we move down to preterite versus imperfect down here. So for an exercise like this, it's pretty easy because they just say pretérito. You don't have to choose. So they're all just going for the form, right? Ayer los niños durmieron, right? So you just need to match the verb with its subject in the preterite. And probably something very similar here with the imperfect, same story. El imperfecto, so you don't have to choose between the two. They're telling you that you simply need the imperfect. Cuando yo era niño, vivíamos en un pueblo pequeño. And in el apartamento, here you're going to have to choose between the two. So it's all about the context. Remember, the preterite describes what happened, while the imperfect describes what was happening. So you need both to tell a story. So quite often there are big fat clues about which way you need to go. So cuando Adriana se esta mañana, well, you're talking about complete action. So you're going to say when she got up this morning, as opposed to when she was getting up this morning. It's not impossible to say that, but it's not really the context. So what happened? Okay, well, when she got up this morning, what was happening? It was really cold. So this illustrates perfectly that difference between what happened when she got up. That's what happened. What was happening? What was ongoing? Oh, it was cold. And it still was cold, and it continued to be cold. So that action is seen as continuous. Hacía frío. So that's the main idea, and that's what you can look forward to as far as the exam goes, which is set for tomorrow, Thursday, by midnight, as always. So that's what's happening in Lección 3, and we're coming up on, excuse me, Lección 4, La salud y el bienestar. Vocabulary has to do with health and your well-being, and several grammar points. Well, not several, three. There are always three biggies, right? So we've got the subjunctive, we've got commands, and we've got the use of por versus para. So that's coming up real soon. In the meantime, let's pop back to Canvas, and you've just finished up El amor a primera vista. I hope you had fun with it. So it looks like almost everybody completed this assignment. So I'm going to be grading these, looking at them in the next couple of days. And in the meantime, we've got one more. This is the final one. We're heading into the final stretch, believe it or not. I told you it would go fast. And let's take a look at it. So under assignments, we have, oops, I blew it. Under assignments, we've got discussion blog número 2, cuenta lo que pasó. So tell what happened. So follow the instructions carefully as always, and submit your main blog by Sunday the 7th by midnight, and then 2 responses 2 days later by Tuesday the 9th. So the really hard deadline is the 9th, but you should get your responses up by the 7th. Cuenta lo que pasó. In Lección 3, you watched the video Adiós Mamá. Remember? in which a young man falls victim to a fraud perpetrated by a motherly grifter. Have you or someone you know ever been the victim of a similar crime? I have. I can't tell you how many times I've been ripped off. I've traveled a lot all over the world, and I've finally learned pretty much how not to be so gullible and how not to get ripped off. But it's challenging. They're always trying to get you, right? And especially these days through text or email or a telephone, something like that. Ugh, it's just nerve-wracking. So, in your post, tell what happened to you. Write entirely in Spanish and use correctly several examples of verbs in the preterite and imperfect. That's what we're going for, right? You want to use the past tense. Include an embedded image, like you did before with the first discussion blog, that relates somehow to your experience. If you can't think of something fraudulent or when you were a victim, something that happened to you, or someone that you know, just feel free to make one up. It doesn't matter. Make sure you tell a good story though, right? And your original post must have a minimum of 10 complete sentences in Spanish. So here we have our prompt. ¿Fuiste alguna vez víctima de un crimen o fraude como el que viste en el video Adiós Mamá? Cuenta lo que pasó. Were you a victim of a crime or a fraud such as the one that you saw in the video Adiós Mamá? Tell what happened. And here we have an embedded image, right, that gives you that idea that they're always trying to get your money. And believe me, they are. They're coming up with so many tricky ways to do that. So, as they say, caveat emptor. In Latin, to the buyer beware. So in other words, just watch out. So again, just to review, you're doing your final discussion blog, Cuenta lo que pasó. The original post, Sunday by midnight. And then for full credit, you've got to reach out to 2 of your peers and comment on their posts by Tuesday at midnight to get full credit. These comments, of course, are worth 15 points each for a total of 30, and your main post is worth 70. So, and again, you need to have an embedded image. If not, you'll lose points. So, yo creo que es suficiente por ahora. Si tienen alguna pregunta, por favor, mándenme un correo electrónico. Si no, suerte con todo y nos vemos muy pronto. Hasta luego.